Hello and welcome back to Parc Fermé Parlay with Kieran Downey. We're here after the Hungarian qualifying session, and what a quali it was. Oh, I don't think I'll get over that one for a while. I really don't, because one, just a pretty decent quali, but two, the result, Charles Leclerc, the man that you are, what a lap. Now, before we get into talking everything qualifying, I want to say that you guys can now submit your driver ratings through the link in the description box down below. The rating is out of 10 and it is for the performance of the drivers so far this season, with 1 being incredibly poor performance and 10 being amazing performance, and they've just been absolutely superb, stellar, no notes. We will be taking all of your guys' predictions and doing our mid-season driver ratings during the summer break. You can also leave your predictions for the next 10 races after the summer break from Zandvoort to Abu Dhabi, and we will be taking your guys' predictions and we will be doing a predictions for the rest of the year video during the summer break as well. However, before we come and talk about Charles Leclerc, we have to talk about Q1, Q2. And kicking things off with Q1, the drivers out were in P20, Alex Albon, Nico Hülkenberg, Esteban Ocon, Pierre Gasly, and Yuki Tsunoda in P16. One thing that played a huge part in this qualifying session was the track evolution, and it was something that caught some of the drivers out, some of the teams out, and no more is that evident than with Williams. They were very early out onto the track in Q1, set the initial flying laps, and then just slowly tumbled down the order as all the other cars started to come out and the track really began to ramp up. Both drivers, Alex and Carlos, were struggling for grip. They ended up actually aborting a set of flying runs to get back into the garage to do a quick turnaround to go out for a final flying lap in Q1, which would have brought both of them to 3 laps total. I didn't think that they would be out. Sainz made huge improvements in his flying lap, and Alex just didn't have it in him, just couldn't improve and was knocked out. Very unfortunate for Albon, and just not where I expected him to be. I don't expect them to be qualifying dead last on the road. Generally speaking, I expect both Williams drivers to at least make it into Q2. So big shocker there for Albon. Hülkenberg, another one who kind of struggled out there a little bit. Turn 12 was a big issue for a lot of the drivers. It caught a lot of them out. Not only Hülkenberg, Piastri, Hamilton, Leclerc. And I'm very surprised at Nico Hülkenberg being out in P19. I expected him to do more. I imagine he expected to do more, given the fact that Bortoleto managed to get through to Q3. The track ramping up as aggressively as it did, the drivers that were coming out a bit later, finding more grip in the track, therefore finding more speed, more time, meant that Hülkenberg just kind of got pushed down, which is a shame because, as I said, his teammate did manage to make it into Q3. Ocon out in P18, he did have a screw in his front right tyre, I believe it was. I don't know if the stewards are looking into that. It kind of feels like something that they would want to investigate. And I don't know if it did have any real hampering on his lap times, but I don't think it's a coincidence that he's got a screw in his tyre, he's out P18. He also just didn't have a lot of pace, to be honest with you. Quite surprised for Pierre Gasly to be out in P17 as well. Again, I think another driver that was really sort of caught out by the track evolution, not really being able to find the pace. And it's an interesting one because Gasly has been qualifying really well. He's consistently getting into the higher positions either in Q2 or the lower Q3 positions. And he has been running very, very well. His results don't really show that, but his drives have been incredibly good. And I do think a lot of that is down to the car. Specifically, the power unit in the car. I don't think the Alpine is bad in terms of the chassis. I think they can build a half-decent race car, but what they can't do is get their power unit to being in a competitive space. And I definitely think that Alpine could be a team to watch for going into next year. As I said, they seem to be able to build a half-decent car in terms of the chassis and everything, but with a new Mercedes power unit in there, that could make a huge difference for them. However, that's obviously in the future, and right now, he's out in P17 for only the second time being out-qualified by his teammate, by Franco Colapinto. And then we have Yuki Tsunoda, who I thought was having a much better weekend, And I did think that this was maybe going to start being the sort of turnaround, that we were going to see some sort of better performances from Tsunoda. Red Bull have been struggling all weekend, right from the get-go. And the struggles that Red Bull are having this weekend are very evident by Max Verstappen. We'll obviously come on and talk about him shortly, but he was struggling in FP1. He was around a second off the pace in FP2. He's been reporting that the car has been undrivable. We then get to FP3. He seems to be a little bit happier, as does Tsunoda. And then we get to qualifying, and both the drivers seem to look a lot happier. But Tsunoda's out in Q1. And listen, it's a decent qualifying effort from Tsunoda when you're looking at it through a teammate head-to-head lens. You know, he's a 10th behind Max, but the difference is Tsunoda's out P16 and Max is through in 11th. And all that's splitting them is a 10th of a second. I feel bad for Tsunoda because I did think that maybe we were going to start seeing a turnaround in performance for him. And I wasn't the only one, and it was quite a lot of the chatter that he was looking a lot happier in the car. But unfortunately, Red Bull just don't have the speed this weekend. And you can tell that they're really struggling for pace because they've had to use 2 sets of tyres, both the drivers, to try and get through. And unfortunately for Tsunoda, just couldn't make it. Moving on to Q2 and the drivers out were Kimi Antonelli in P15, followed by Franco Colapinto, Carlos Sainz, Lewis Hamilton and Oliver Bearman. Now, Kimi Antonelli actually qualified higher on the road but had a lap time deleted, which demoted him down to P15. It was a track limits violation, and it was something that was catching quite a few of the drivers out. I spoke about this last week, and it's just another week. I spoke about this last weekend, and yet again, I feel incredibly bad for Kimi Antonelli. He's just not having a great performance. And, you know, Antonelli's not really had it easy over the past few weekends, and he's definitely going to be feeling the pressure. But so far, up until qualifying, he'd been driving pretty good. Like, it'd been a markable difference to the performances we've seen over the past few weekends. And he looked much better in FP3. It looked like, you know, they could be a challenger for maybe not pole, but definitely like a second or third row. I imagine that if Antonelli had managed to even make it a little bit closer to Russell, Toto would be, you know, sort of be like, right, I'm happy with that. But it's just another disappointing performance for Antonelli. And I actually can't help but think that Mercedes potentially played all the wrong cards for him. The team sent Antonelli out on used tyres for his second flying laps of Q2, and I can't help but think that it was just a complete waste. They were obviously trying to save 2 sets of fresh soft tyres for Q3, but what good are these fresh softs if your driver isn't making it into Q3? I don't understand why they weren't a little bit easier on him, why they didn't stick a pair of fresh softs on, give him a better chance of making it through, and at least he's in Q3. You know, the pressure that he would have been feeling to hook up a good lap from 14th going into that flying run would have been huge. And couple that with the fact he's on used soft, it just doesn't really make sense. And then, I mean, you could say that if he'd been on new softs, would he have gotten the track limits violation? You don't know. I mean, there's every chance that they could have stuck him on a pair of new boots, sent him out, and he would have still gotten a track limits violation and had his lap time deleted. This is all coulda, woulda, shoulda. However, I do just feel like Mercedes didn't give Antonelli the best chance of making it through to Q3 by sending him out to do his second flying run on used soft tyres. It just feels like the wrong call. And the team trying to save that extra set of fresh softs for Q3, it's just all for nothing now, isn't it? For Franco Colapinto, I don't really expect him to get any higher. I'm actually surprised he managed to get 14th. You know, only the second time since he's joined Alpine as a full-time driver from taking over from Jack Doohan has he managed to out-qualify Pierre Gasly. So that's at least a positive for him, you know, getting into Q2, another positive. I don't, as I said, expect him really to get any higher considering the fact that this is quite a technical, quite tricky track. He's not in the best of cars, his pace was lacking slightly. In fact, the only reason he was 14th is because Antonelli had a lap time deleted. I'm trying not to detract from a better performance than what we've been seeing. However, I can't help but feel like this is maybe a bit of a ceiling that we've reached with Colapinto. Carlos Sainz in P13, I can't put a good reading on Sainz, to be honest with you. He's struggled really even since the start of the year, I would say, to put in a solid full weekend performance. He's showing signs and flashes of true pace within that Williams car, but he suffered a lot from bad luck and reliability and external issues, and his woes have been pretty big. And that has continued into this weekend. FP2, he lost his telemetry, which meant he lost all sorts of things in the car, like, his DRS wouldn't activate because he had no telemetry, and he was losing all sorts of things throughout FP2. FP3 is kind of struggling for grip, as was a lot of the drivers. It's basically just traction zones throughout the whole thing, so that kind of chews up and takes away the grip out of the tyres. We come to qualifying. He's made a massive improvement in Q1 to get him through to Q2, just doesn't have the pace to get him through, and I think it may be a bit of a struggle for him, for both Williams drivers actually, to have any hope of scoring points tomorrow. This is not an easy track to overtake on, and I don't think we will see the Williams finishing in the points tomorrow. The big shocker is Lewis Hamilton. So I'm going to quickly touch on Behrman before we touch on Hamilton. Behrman out in P11. Again, I kind of feel like that's the ceiling of that car's performance around this track. I don't think it's a bad performance from Behrman. I think he could be in a little bit of a sweet spot to maybe pick up a couple of points, but nothing huge. But I do think that, we kind of maybe reached the limit of that car in all, flat out qualifying pace. Now, Hamilton obviously finished just behind him P12, and I wanted to leave this one to last because that was the big shocker in Q2. Lewis Hamilton being out in 12th. This is the worst performance for Lewis Hamilton at the Hungaroring based on all-out pace. He's had reliability issues before, but on all-out, on-the-track pace, this is his worst performance in his history of coming to this track. And Hamilton being out in Q2 will have done nothing but leave Ferrari scratching their heads, considering that Charles Leclerc managed to put it on pole. I was looking at Ferrari throughout the sessions and I thought, you know what, they're doing quite a good job. They seem to be finding the issues and everything and sort of trying to get them sorted, and whatever problems there are, they're sort of resolving them, although be it slightly slower. That being said, and I know we're all shocked that Hamilton is out, but I don't really think we should be, because he's been reporting that he has been uncomfortable and not vibing with the car since free practice 1. He's been struggling all weekend, and we get to qualifying and he was very nearly out in Q1, managed to get through by the skin of his teeth, and here we are again, out in Q2. His qualifying performances this year have been, quite frankly, abysmal, and he knows it. And we're beginning to get some comments and, that kind of feeling that we've seen towards his tenure at Mercedes. He did an interview with Sky Sports just after the qualifying session there, and he was like, it's just me, I'm useless. I'm absolutely useless. And it's wild to see that Lewis Hamilton is talking like this. It was wild at Mercedes, it's wild at Ferrari. And again, he shows flashes and signs that he is, beginning to understand the car and get to grips with it, and there's the odd decent performance. I think to last weekend in Spa, when he managed to fight his way through, that was during the race. There is just a question of whether or not Hamilton is entering that stage where his age is beginning to play a part in his performance, and that's why we're maybe not seeing the qualifying performances that we expect. He's still able to sort of pull it out the bag and race trim, but there does seem to be a sort of deep-rooted issue that Lewis is experiencing when it comes to qualifying. And to be fair, that is something that Ferrari is a bit back to front on. They will sacrifice quali pace for race pace. However, Charles has managed to get it on pole and Lewis is sitting P12. That's a big difference there. And as I said, it'll be something that's left Ferrari scratching their heads. It's probably left all of us scratching our heads. That being said, I do think that the age thing is a small part in a number of reasons as to why Lewis is struggling. The switch after 12 years to Ferrari, going from a team that you know inside and out like the back of your hand, to go through a change in which this team works and operates, and a completely different setup of car and, all that kind of stuff. And I do think that it is, a string of bad performances within a season that is also a string of seasons of bad performances that is probably weighing on him. And I do think that he's probably just incredibly ready for the summer break to take a little bit of time off. I think all the drivers are, to be honest with you. But a huge, huge shock to see him out in Q2. Moving on to Q3, and the lineup is in P10, Isaac Hadjar followed by Liam Lawson, Max Verstappen, Gabriel Bortoleto and Lance Stroll. P5, Fernando Alonso followed by George Russell, Lando Norris, Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc on pole. I have to say Isaac Hadjar has been looking incredibly decent all weekend, so I'm not surprised that he's managed to make it into Q3 yet again. I actually think he's the only driver left this year that has not been knocked out in Q1. Long may that continue. Hadjar actually only ran the once in Q3. He didn't do 2 flying runs. Is that perhaps maybe why he didn't get any higher up? I don't think so, because obviously his first flying run was around about the time of everybody's second flying run, so he would have gotten the benefit of the track evolution. However, I don't think that Hadjar running previous to that would have got many higher up, because I do think that the second flying runs of everyone would have knocked him probably back down a little bit. Another great performance from Liam Lawson, getting into Q3, qualifying 9th. I said last week that I was beginning to think that we were seeing the turnaround in performance from Liam Lawson, and that what we were going to start seeing is a lot more performances that we were used to and expecting from him, where, you know, when he came and replaced Daniel Ricciardo and he was qualifying decent, and he was, you know, when he replaced Ricciardo both those times actually, he was qualifying well, he was beginning to score points. And I think that this is just him, as I said last weekend, getting the confidence back in himself, in the car, and now we're beginning to see some good performances from Lawson. Max Verstappen sitting P8 is another shocker of this qualifying session, I have to be honest. As I said, Red Bull haven't looked steady this entire weekend. Now, most of the teams have been using this weekend to start testing out upgrades that they've been bringing over the past few race weekends, and most of the teams have gone for a sort of higher downforce setup on the rear wing, including Red Bull, who have also got a revised front wing for this weekend. Now, as I said, Red Bull were struggling throughout FP1, Verstappen quite a bit. He was struggling with understeer and was around about a second off the pace in FP2. We come to FP3 and again, doesn't find the performance in the car that we usually expect him to have. What I will say, and this is something that we spoke about before, is that Max Verstappen does have an incredible resilience, and it's something that a lot of the other drivers wouldn't. You know, Max can come into a weekend and be off the pace during an FP1, FP2 session, and then come into an FP3 and qualifying session on the Saturday the next day and absolutely kill it and storm his way to pole position. And I've mentioned it before, and it's like Red Bull just bring an entirely different car for the Saturday. Whereas there's other drivers who, if, you know, they weren't at the front for quite a lot of the weekend, then their confidence would be knocked by it, and therefore their performance, again, would sort of suffer. I thought that we were having one of those Max Verstappen weekends that he was going to, you know, kill it. And purely due to the fact that when we got into FP3, he was looking a lot happier, as was the car. And then we get to qualifying and he's just off the pace massively. Not once did I look at Max's times and go, God, you know, he really could put a fight in for pole or for the front row. I didn't think he'd sit P8, and I did not think he would be out-qualified by the likes of Bortoleto and both the Aston Martin drivers. And it's just another example of how Red Bull are really struggling this weekend and this season. They've not got the performance in the car that we expected them to have. And, you know, this is a weekend where Max has reaffirmed his commitment to the team for 2026. I do feel like the team is definitely going to have to pull something out of the bag for 2026 to be able to keep Max after that. They're going to have to do something special. As for this weekend, I do think Verstappen's going to struggle a little bit. If he's got any chance of, I think he'll score points, but if he's got any chance of trying to get a podium, he's got a very tough fight in his hands. A very tough fight. I can't imagine the likes of Alonso, Russell and Norris are just going to move to the side and let him pass. To quote George Russell, just because he's Max Verstappen in a Red Bull. Fantastic result from Gabriel Bortoleto. Absolutely sensational. Again, probably something that will have left Sauber scratching their heads. You know, they have, as evidence, two very good qualifiers. We know Hulkenberg's a good qualifier, just did not have the pace to get him out of Q1. But another Q3 appearance for Bortoleto, and I am loving that. Said it last week, he's putting in decent performances, and yes, sometimes the results similar to Gasly, haven't been there. But what I will say is, unlike Gasly, what we're seeing right now from Bortoleto is incredible consistency, and I'm loving these Q3 and points appearances. It's a shame for Hülkenberg that he didn't have the pace to get him out of Q1, but well done, Bortoleto. Fantastic result for both the Aston Martin drivers, sitting P6, P5. They have looked on it all weekend, from FP1 right the way through to the final moments of Q3. Every session of this qualifying, they have looked incredibly strong and just completely on it. And I do think that they will be, both of them actually, for the first time I think, a contender for some very good points, which is great to see. Russell in P4. One thing to note for Mercedes is that they have gone back to the old suspension for both the cars, which is something that seems to have been able to help George Russell, not so much Antonelli. Very good result for Russell, and not without putting in a fight to get there. He's said that he's really struggled this entire weekend, and that, you know, it's not the result he was hoping for, but better than the result that he expected to get, especially when Antonelli went out in Q2. Then we've got the McLaren boys in P2, P3, Piastri P2, Norris P3. Not what I expected from McLaren, but that's because I expected a McLaren front row lockout. I did not expect a 2-3. I thought that this would be plain sailing for them. They have looked mighty, mighty strong this entire weekend. I thought that it was just going to be the easiest McLaren front row lockout. It's a track that they're both very strong at. I think it was a front row lockout for them last year. Norris was on pole, Piastri second. It was a McLaren 1-2. It definitely felt that we were going to see the same, albeit without the drama and the, you know, the team mess of last year. Definitely felt that we were going to get a very similar result to last year. A McLaren front row lockout and a McLaren 1-2 in the race. We still might get the McLaren 1-2 in the race, but I'm just so surprised that neither of them could improve in those second flying runs of Q3 to get P1, either of the drivers. I think Norris set like a personal best in the first or second sector of his second flying run. Say that 5 times fast, but neither of them could improve at all, really, to go and take the pole away from Charles Leclerc, who was on pole by like 2/10, I think. So, interesting one there, and I am very intrigued to see what happens tomorrow. I'll come on to that slightly in a second. Charles Leclerc, P1. Get in, my man. What a result. Came out of nowhere. No one's seen that coming. No one seen Charles Leclerc getting pole coming, especially when Hamilton was out in Q2. I thought Charles Leclerc, P4. P3, P4 at best. Second row at best. I did not expect him to stick it on pole. It was an incredible lap. An incredible lap from Leclerc. And as I said, I'm very surprised that the McLaren drivers couldn't pip him, as evidenced by my reaction when he got pole.
Yeah! What the fuck? Leclerc's on pole! What? Get in! Oh! Charles Leclerc, the man that you are!
At least I didn't overreact, eh? To start the weekend, you know, saying that this was his worst track, he never really performs that well there. To go and stick it on pole, he might have to change his thoughts and feelings on this track. It definitely feels like he took a couple of risks that maybe the McLaren drivers didn't. And do I think he will win? There is a chance. I will say there's a chance. If he can maintain the lead after lap 1, there is a very good chance that he could win this, because it is quite hard to overtake in Hungary. And that's what I'm intrigued to see what happens tomorrow, because you've got these two drivers that are sitting P2, P3 in the McLaren boys that are in a very tight fight for the championship. So neither of them can really afford to take a huge risk that would lead to a low point or no points finish. They cannot be DNFing. They cannot have either of them. They cannot afford a DNF. They cannot afford to finish outside the points. They can't even really afford to finish in the low points, and one of them the other. The pair of them have to try and get as many points as they can tomorrow, and they will, one, be battling themselves, which could then allow Charles to open up a little bit of a gap tomorrow if they're squabbling. But there's a very, big risk tomorrow for both of these McLaren drivers in what do they try and do. They obviously want to try and win, both of them. They want to try and get a 1-2, but they're also going to be fighting one another for the win and fighting Charles Leclerc. It's just going to be all very, very interesting, and I cannot wait. As I said at the top of the show, you can now start submitting your driver ratings in the link below in the description box. It's out of 10, with 10 being a fantastic performance so far in the season and a 1 being incredibly poor performance so far in the season. And we will obviously be back with our mid-season driver ratings during the summer break. I have also added in a little selection for you guys to leave your predictions for the rest of this year, and we'll be coming back with a predictions for the final part of the season during the summer break as well. But that is everything from us. We'll see you very soon. Love you. Bye.